Hello, good evening and welcome to the David Ellis Report. Tonight we are talking paramilitaries. On Tuesday evening, Boris Johnson addressed the nation to explain why he has chosen to take England back into lockdown.
We need to suppress the virus now. And as for that minority who may continue to flout the rules, we will enforce those rules with tougher penalties and fines of up to £10,000. We will put more police out on the streets and use the army to backfill if necessary.
Boris is talking about Operation Temper. This is the government's plan to deploy troops in support of the police in key locations following a major terrorist attack. It was put into effect for the first time on May the 22nd, 2017, following the Manchester Arena bombing, and for the second time following the Parsons Green bombing. The original plan provided for up to 5,100 service personnel from all three services to be deployed to augment the armed police officers engaged in protective security duties at key sites in the United Kingdom. This raises some questions. First of all, is it new police policy or is it even British policy? I think we must all have noticed how the police in UK, their uniforms have changed over the last several decades. The bobby on the beat has become an armed and more recently much more like a paramilitary in appearance. In parallel, successive UK governments have poured millions of pounds into the transformation of the police, claiming they need to build a new capability to respond to changes in criminal threat. They've claimed the whole police system needs to be reimagined, not just reformed incrementally. So that we can understand just how far the world has come, we should perhaps remind ourselves of the 9 principles attributed to Robert Peel when the modern police force was first established. Principle 1. The basic mission for which the police exists is to prevent crime and disorder. Principle 2. The ability of the police to perform their duties is dependent upon public approval of police actions. Principle 3. The police must secure the willing cooperation of the public in voluntary observance of the law to be able to secure and maintain the respect of the public. Principle 4. The degree of cooperation of the public that can be secured diminishes proportionately to the necessity of the use of physical force. Principle 5. Police seek and preserve public favour, not by catering to the public opinion, but constantly demonstrating absolute impartial service to the law. Principle 6. Police use physical force to the extent necessary to secure observance of the law or to restore order only when the exercise of persuasion, advice and warning is found to be insufficient. Principle 7. Police at all times should maintain relationship with the public that gives reality to the historic tradition that the police are the public and the public are the police. Principle 8. The police should always direct their action strictly towards their functions and never appear to usurp the powers of the judiciary. Principle 9. The test of police efficiency is the observance of crime and disorder, not the visible evidence of police action in dealing with it. There is no mention of military backfilling, machine guns or body armour in Peel's principles. The militarisation of the police is international policy, and that policy is not simply about providing the police with more militarised training and equipment. It's about the merging of police and military functions. The European Defence Agency conference in November 2015 was called the European Defence Matters. Key speakers at the conference were NATO's Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg and his associate, EU High Representative Federica Mogherini.
But every threat today is hybrid, and this can be obviously scary. But on the other side, there is one world power which has the tools to face complex threat. Well, that is the European Union. Complementarity here is the key. I think we have all moved beyond the old-fashioned cultural dispute between defense and development. The same holds true for what is civilian versus what is military. The reality here is one of multipurpose. We tend to focus too much on dividing lines and get stuck into artificial divisions that no longer correspond to reality.
Artificial divisions that no longer correspond to reality. This sounds very similar in intent to the comments made by Mark Carlton Smith, which we showed you last week. Mogherini's call for the breakdown of faux artificial lines between military and police were echoed a couple of years later by NATO's Deputy Secretary General, who said that we need to break down the silos between military and civilian institutions. Her comments were followed up by several tweets from NATO, highlighting the so-called non-lethal weapons being deployed to NATO personnel. Non-lethal weapons provide options to troops faced with uncertainty, they said. One Twitter reply made the point that once troops are given non-lethal weapons, they are no longer soldiers. They are policemen doing law and order. This is the type of non-lethal weapon advertised by NATO. The manufacturer describes the item as less lethal but not non-lethal. And these are the types of rounds they fire, including rounds that if they hit you, release an irritant designed to incapacitate further, as if being hit by one of these things isn't bad enough. The manufacturer warns these weapons can cause fatal injury. So that was in 2017. In 2019, former German Defence Minister Ursula von der Leyen became President of the European Commission. During her campaign to win that role, she said this.
Now, I'm going to jump right forward now to the present day. And I'd like to talk about 4 different components which we introduced back then, which I believe are the important structural elements for setting up a European defence union. First of all, just 2-3 weeks ago, we were able to for the first time, we were able to give the red light for a European command capacity in Brussels. That's for the first time that civil and military instruments would actually be commanded together, and where these commands would actually come from one single central command office. That's an essential step forward. It was unthinkable a short while ago, but it's precisely the right approach to have if we want a European flavour to our defence policy.
To what degree do these people envisage merging military and police functions? 4 days before Al Johnson, Boris, Sasha to his friends, or however many AKAs the chap has got, addressed the nation, Tobias Ellwood, chairman of Defence Committee and serving 77 Brigade officer, asked Boris to involve the military in dealing with coronavirus.
So secondly, relating to the government's response to COVID-19, please could we make greater use of our fine armed forces? It is not a mark of failure to lean on their versatile skills more so than we are currently doing when we are faced with such an enduring emergency and trying to move perhaps onto a war footing. The one department in Whitehall that actually plans for and trains for crisis situations is the MOD. Please would you consider taking more advantage of their incredible skill sets at the centre here in Whitehall in assisting with strategic planning, operational delivery, command and control, and managing the narrative.
Lieutenant Colonel Ellwood is expressing the fusion doctrine: strategic planning, operational delivery, command and control, and most importantly, control of the narrative. Fusion doctrine, introduced under the May regime in the National Security Capability Review published in March 2018, the resurgence of state-based threats, it said, intensifying wider state competition and the erosion of the rules-based international order, making it harder to build consensus and tackle global threats. Traditional channels have been largely discarded in favour of digital and social media platforms. This, combined with a decline of trust in traditional sources and information and the era of so-called fake news. Building a culture of common purpose across departments requires improved accountability to shift incentives and behaviours towards a more genuine whole-of-government approach. We are taking a comprehensive approach to tackling the evil ideology of extremism, whether violent or non-violent, Islamist or far and extreme right-wing. We will establish a new intelligence framework. We will make community engagement a cornerstone of our response to building resilience within communities and reduce their public tolerance for criminal behaviour. National resilience is truly collective, depending on all of us: emergency responders, local and central government, the armed forces, business, communities, and individual members of the public. We will create a cross-government soft power strategy while respecting the independence of the BBC World Service, British Council, and many British institutions, and brands that contribute to our soft power. We will significantly expand the National Security Communications team to make communications an integral part of our national security. Many capabilities that can contribute to national security lie outside traditional national security departments, and so we need stronger partnerships across government within the private and third sectors. Fusion doctrine demolishes any separation of powers or accountability. This is what Lieutenant Colonel Elwood demands of Boris, and Boris has delivered. Speaking in Trafalgar Square, Robin Tilbrook, a lawyer and chairman of the English Democrats Party, argued that Boris has been operating well beyond his authority in everything he has done under the pretext of coronavirus.
13th of March, they're starting to panic, they say. 23rd of March, Boris comes on television and tells us that he's locking the whole country down with immediate effect. Boris had no power as Prime Minister to lock the country down. No power. It was a bluff. It wasn't true. But we then started getting the police and so on enforcing it as if it already was true. 23rd of March was when he said that. The very next day, in Parliament, they produce their emergency legislation, which they say is their emergency legislation, the coronavirus bill, 370 pages of it. Now you imagine how long it took to write 370 pages or thereabouts of closely written statutory wordage, which has the most wide-ranging powers in it that you could imagine. It is far wider in terms of the powers granted to the executive, to the government, than anything that was granted in either the First or the Second World War under the Emergency Powers Act or the War Powers Act.
Robin Tilbrook went on to say that Boris brought in new legislation rather than using the existing emergency legislation, because the Civil Contingency Act requires government to account for its actions to Parliament. The new legislation does not. The police are not only being militarised, they are also being politicised. Let's contrast the behaviour of the police at the recent so-called anti-lockdown protests in Trafalgar Square with an earlier Black Lives Matter protest, both of which took place under lockdown conditions. As you can see, for the anti-lockdown protest, the police turned out in full riot gear and viciously attacked the protesters. For Black Lives Matter, they knelt. This evening I want to leave you with this. A final thought on political policing from a general election speech made in 1945 by Winston Churchill, who had the knowledge, understanding and experience to sum up socialist, Marxist and Communist Party policy. Good night.
Socialism is in its essence an attack not only upon British enterprise, but upon the right of an ordinary man or woman to breathe freely without having a harsh, clumsy, tyrannical hand clapped across their mouths and nostrils. A free parliament. Look at that. A free parliament is odious to the socialist doctrinaire. Have we not heard Mr. Herbert Morrison descant upon his plans to curtail parliamentary procedure and pass laws simply by resolutions of broad principle in the House of Commons, afterwards to be left by Parliament to the executive and to the bureaucrats to elaborate and enforce by departmental regulations? As for Sir Stafford Cripps on Parliament in the socialist state, I have not time to read you what is said, but perhaps it will meet the public eye during the election campaign. But I will go farther. I declare to you from the bottom of my heart that no socialist system can be established without a political police. Many of those who are advocating socialism or voting socialist today will be horrified at this idea. That is because they are short-sighted. That is because they do not see where their theories are leading us. No socialist government conducting the entire life and industry of the country could afford to allow free, sharp, or violently worded expressions of public discontent. They would have to fall back on some form of Gestapo, no doubt very humanely directed in the first instance. And this would nip in the bud opinion and its forms. It would stop criticism and it reared its head. And it would gather all the power to the Supreme Party and the party leaders rising like stately pinnacles above their vast bureaucracies of civil servants. No longer servants and no longer civil.